What can we understand about the Minnesota Vikings from an analytical perspective? Today, we have a special guest, Dalton Wasserman of Pro Football Focus, here to talk about the Minnesota Vikings and some of the nuances behind their 5-0 start, how they can project it moving forward, and the thought process of being wrong early on and having to evolve your opinion, because that's something a lot of analysts can't do, but it's something that we always talk about here. And we're going to have a lot of fun conversations with Dalton here on the Real Forno Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Real Forno Show, hosted by the one and only Tyler Forness. A to Z Sports sought him out to be their Minnesota Vikings reporter and NFL analyst. And he's a proud contributor over at SKOL North's Purple Daily. Tyler is also the captivating host of The Good, The Bad, and The Hungry on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network, and a founding member of Vikings First and SKOL.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special episode of the Real Forno Show here on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of October. I'm your host, Tyler Forness. With me, as always, who's moved down to the bottom right corner. He's producer Dave, and to my left, analyst at Pro Football Focus, he is Dalton Wasserman. How are you doing, sir?
Fantastic. Another good week of football down, and we certainly got more coming our way. It's going to be a fun season the rest of the way, especially the way the Minnesota Vikings are playing, huh?
No joke, man. And we were talking a little bit pre-show. The one interesting thing about this Vikings team is no individual aspect of this team is necessarily that surprising. Like if you were to pinpoint, oh, Sam Darnold's playing well. Okay. Situation makes some sense. The defense playing well makes sense. But to have everything come together like it has, I think has truly blown the minds of pretty much everybody outside of the building. When you take a look at this team, Dalton, how do you like quantify like how good this team actually is right now compared to preseason expectations?
I think one thing that people forget is kind of rare is teams that have as much balance as Minnesota does, right? When you talk about, for us, they're our 8th highest graded offense and our 9th highest graded defense, all right? You usually get teams that lean one way and they got to work on something, but they're just solid almost all the way across the board, right? And even working through some injuries, right? They're figuring out the quarterback situation, and J.J. McCarthy got hurt. In the preseason, their top corner, or at least their top corner coming into the season, Mekhi Blackmon, was a guy who I thought was going to be really important to them. He had a great rookie season. He tears his ACL in the preseason, and that's a problem, right? But they just continue to find ways to balance this team out. The pass rush is certainly a lot better, and Brian Flores is coaching the hell out of them. And then offensively, I got to be honest, Sam Darnold, for me, is kind of better. It's surprising that he's playing this good, because he really never showed that with the Jets, and then he had a couple years as a backup, didn't show that with Carolina. This is the best he's ever played, but you're right. I think the environment that he's in has kind of incubated that, right? Where it's like, I think people forget there's so often where we try to separate quarterbacks from their environment. How good is he? Is he elite? Is he not? Is he terrible? And then you go, well, it's kind of more of a range, right? Like Sam Darnold in a terrible environment, maybe still in the Carolina Panthers, probably wouldn't be very good, but you bring him to a team like this with good pass protection, obviously a loaded group of weapons, and he's played something closer to his talent level from when he was drafted 3rd overall.
So let's talk about that aspect, because I think the idea of quarterbacks has really morphed over the course of time. When you had guys like Terry Bradshaw sat for years as the number 1 overall pick before he took over the job. And even some of those stats, they were fine for the era, but if you look at them in retrospect, they're pretty ugly. And moving forward, some guys rarely, Peyton Manning was one of the rare ones who started right away as a rookie, and he was able to overcome an NFL record 29 interceptions and become a first ballot Hall of Famer. But we're starting to see a trend backward towards having guys sit and having guys needing to learn and having these great situations rather than just, hey, I got the guy, and he's going to be able to fix everything for me. Like the guys like Russell Wilson in 2012, Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. Even Josh Allen took a couple of years to really marinate before they made that first AFC Championship game appearance. Are we going to start to see a trend, like I mentioned, backward to where, hey, get the guy, but we're not going to play him until we really fortify everything around him? Because the success of Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield in a better situation for who he is as a quarterback in Tampa Bay, and then now Sam Darnold, we're starting to see a trend of renaissance here with talented guys who just didn't have great surroundings for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, I think what it is we have to remember everything about football is about context, right? And they call it the ultimate team sport. There are so many dependent variables, right, on every play. There's 22 different things happening on every single play. And then you talk about the play call and the coaching and everything that goes on in practice and on the sideline, that there's so few guys that can succeed in subpar environments. That's why I don't really subscribe to the idea of, oh, if a quarterback's in a good environment, well, that's just because the environment. Well, yeah, you have to have a good team to win football games, right? Everybody gets on. A lot of people get on Brock Purdy for, well, that team's just loaded. Well, he's doing his job. What do you want him to not do his job, even though his team is loaded? And I think a Sam Darnold or even a Baker Mayfield, right? Okay, he goes to a better situation in Tampa. He has Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. He should succeed with that. Honestly, there's very few guys in the NFL. Patrick Mahomes may even be the only one who gets a subpar environment or subpar receivers or something like that, and he can still succeed. It takes really special guys to do that. So I think the context of team building and everything that goes into, when you talk about people just praising or blaming the quarterback for everything that happens on a football field, that's not how it works, right? And I think this Vikings team is such a good example of that, where you go, a lot of people would go, casual people would go, well, why are they winning? Oh, Sam Darnold's been good. Well, yeah, but also, it's top 10 pass protection. It's Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. It's a Brian Flores defense that's playing really well. Like, there's so many things that go into it, and sometimes people forget. I mean, one of my favorite phrases in football is complementary football, right? I think the Vikings and even those other teams you mentioned, when you talk about the 49ers or the Buccaneers or Seattle with Geno Smith and his renaissance, they do that. They play complementary football. They don't make their quarterback do everything like he's Patrick Mahomes, because let's be honest, Sam Darnold's not Patrick Mahomes. We've learned that for the last 7 years, right? But he can be good in the right environment, and context always matters with that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting kind of having this general conversation, because quarterback is such a pivotal part, and we've got many metrics, like you guys have developed a PFF war where quarterbacks are just so much more important than other positions. But as you mentioned, there's so much of this that is a team sport. And you need to have 11 guys on your side of the football really be able to do their job in order to really succeed. When you kind of listening to you parse all that out, everything makes a lot of sense. But we're paying top end quarterbacks $50 million plus a year. Dak Prescott just got 60. At a certain point, are we going to see a devaluing of the quarterback position for that reason? Because context matters so much, and you have to have all the right pieces surrounding that quarterback. Are we getting to a point where these guys are, maybe, for lack of a better term, overpaid?
There's some of them that probably are, but it is definitely still the most valuable, the most important position, right? Let's be honest. Quarterbacks win Super Bowls. That's just a fact. But you have to build it right around them. I think the bigger thing is that's why, as opposed to being devalued in free agency and with the second contracts, because they're going to keep making an increasing percent of the salary cap, right? Because when you have a great quarterback, you at least have a floor of, okay, this is what I know my team is going to be. Then I just have to add to that. I think it's just put the greater emphasis on succeeding when you have a guy on a rookie contract, right? When those first 4 or 5 years, when he is making nothing compared to that second contract. That's why a team like the 49ers really needs to win a Super Bowl before they have to pay Brock Purdy that sort of money, right? Or there's other teams, when you look at Trevor Lawrence gets paid now, Jalen Hurts gets paid now, Tua Tagovailoa gets paid now, where it gets a lot harder to win. I think that's what it is. It's not that maybe the quarterback himself isn't worth that. It's that it gets harder to find those elite pieces around him unless you're drafting really well. And the conundrum there is if you're playing well and you have a good quarterback, generally you're picking in the 20s because you made the playoffs and you get the worst draft slot, right? So I think it's a moment where we think it's changed the team building, I think, more than anything, right? Where you go, okay, we have to get this done early in a guy's career. And I know Mahomes is a veteran now, but he also does not make the most money of all the quarterback. What is he, 12th or 13th or something in salary cap percentage or whatever it is this year? Like, it's the same way as Tom Brady was back in the day. Tom Brady knew this, and he always took pay cuts until he got to Tampa. So you just have a different thing where I think teams are more in a rush now. The problem is if that young guy is really good and you haven't won a Super Bowl yet, take Buffalo with Josh Allen, now you're paying him all this money and you're constantly trying to fill the gaps on the rest of your team. So it's more to me about the difficulties in team building after you pay them, as opposed to the quarterback not being worth. Now, again, there are some guys that disappoint and they aren't worth that, right? I mean, we think about, say, a Daniel Jones with the Giants, where you go, he makes 40-something million and it's not really working. But for the most part, if I have a guy like Lawrence or Hurts or somebody like that, they've got to build it around him, and it's just harder to do with less money to work with.
And I think that's kind of the conundrum, because when you look at like a Geno Smith or Baker Mayfield, that's really enticing to have a solid guy making $25 to $35 million when it's a significantly less portion of the salary cap. But I want to kind of shift the conversation to offensive line, because offensive line has been a contentious issue for the Minnesota Vikings since Steve Hutchinson left after the 2011 season. It's been a revolving door of turnstiles. And now you have guys like Ed Ingram and Garrett Bradbury who are, for lack of a better term, they're fine. But when you look at some of the PFF metrics, their pressures are significantly higher. The Vikings, I believe, have 53 pressures per Pro Football Focus. Bradbury has 13 and Ingram has 17 of them. But then when you look at some of the other metrics across like the whole concept of the passing game, the Vikings have like they're like top 5 in time to pressure. So how do we kind of look at some of those stats where pressures are something that's really focused on by not just the public, but let's be honest, us as well, because pressures matter significantly to the offense. But with how the Vikings play offense, how much of that is actually mattering when we're talking about their success?
I mean, it's still going to matter down the line eventually, right? Especially in big games, and sometimes it depends on the matchup. You know, if you're playing somebody with a Chris Jones or a Dexter Lawrence type of player, having someone who's struggling at center and right guard is going to matter a lot. It's going to, you know, if you're playing a team with not as much interior rush, then, you know, you can get away with it, right? I think about like when you guys play the Bears, they don't have the best interior rushers, might not be as big a factor. So it's always context and matchups and things like that. But no, I mean, the good thing is, okay, Garrett Bradbury's grading a 50 in his pass blocking grade. Is it below average? Yeah. Is it so awful he shouldn't be on the field? No. Now Ingram's is a 29.4. That's rough for sure. But if one guy out of the 5 is struggling, usually that's a pretty good offensive line. It's hard to find 5 superstars up there, right? So I think the big thing is, and here's the thing too, Kevin O'Connell's so good at scheming protections and then getting into the bootlegs, and he runs as much play action as any team in the league. It's different if they were just a straight drop back team, if they were something more like the Cincinnati Bengals, right? And they struggled on the interior like that. And the Bengals have done that in the past. And when you're a straight drop back team all the time, that's different, right? If you're a 5-step, 7-step drop team, whereas if you're Minnesota and you're running, there's a lot of different schemes that go into it. There's a lot of the Shanahan principles and the bootlegs and rolling Sam Darnold and there's other things that can protect him, and the quarterback can protect himself, right? The one thing I've noticed with Darnold, as on top of all his other accolades this year, he's getting rid of the ball quicker. This is the most decisive I've ever seen him throw the football. He hits his back foot and he gets rid of it. He's throwing better this year. I forget the exact numbers on our grading, but he's throwing better this year on his first read than he ever has in his career. So the quarterback, look, offensive line helps quarterback helps offensive line. And as far as the amount of pressures, I think there's more than one thing that goes into this, right? Where it's the amount of pressures, yeah, but it's also the quality of the pressures too. You mentioned, what is it, one of the 5 best in average time to pressure? That's big. That's big time, because you're talking about the quality of wins and losses up front, right? And if you're giving up pressures in 3 seconds or later, that's not as bad as if you're giving up pressure in 1.8. Then it's a disaster, right? So there is a balance of looking into more than just one number with it. But I think there is a part where O'Connell and Darnold help the offensive line as much as the protection helps them.
So I think that's a really interesting point, that pressures, and we've talked about it a lot on this show, there's a difference in quality. But one of the, as far as the public facing data, because you guys have way more on the back end than we were able to have access to, we see the raw number. The raw number for Ed Ingram is 17, but the quality of those pressures vary significantly on a play-to-play basis. Is there a way from what we're able to see to kind of be able to parse some of those numbers out without just directly watching the film, to help educate the audience as far as what's good and what's really, really bad?
Yeah, so the two other things that I think to look at are when you find pass rush win rates as well, because that'll tell you even if Darnold gets rid of the ball before, say, the pressure is coming, that'll tell you really how often that somebody like an Ed Ingram is losing his block. And the pass rush grade is really the big thing, right? So you talk about, okay, Ed Ingram's got a 29 in pass blocking grade, and Garrett Bradbury's got a 50. But, Ingram's only got 4 more pressures, right? I'll even admit to you that 4 pressures is not going to, in itself, cost it 20 points, right, in our pass blocking grades. That's not how it works. There's other blocks behind the scenes. Let's say, again, if Darnold gets rid of the ball before pressure can get there, we still grade those blocks, right? And if you won or lost and how quickly you won or lost. So the pass blocking grade, is the biggest. It's the biggest thing when it comes to trying to boil that all together, because it does factor in, yes, the amount of pressure, but also the quality of it, right? So when you talk about maybe there's a tackle with, I'd say Christian Darrisaw and Brian O'Neill, right? Darrisaw's given up 9 pressures, O'Neill's given up 3. Some people would think, Darrisaw should be so much lower than O'Neill, when the facts are it's like a 1.5 lower. It's not that much, because those 3 pressures, the quality of them, I can guarantee you Christian Darrisaw didn't lose within 1.2 seconds. He's too good for that, first of all. But that's just the sort of thing that our pass blocking grades try to boil as much as we can into one number is the combination of the amount of pressure and the quality of it. You could give up 3 pressures in a game instead of 10 and still have a really bad pass blocking grade if you really got beat bad on those 3. So there is a lot of context that goes into it.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. One last question before we move on, because there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about on the defensive side of the football. One of the things that I think people have an issue with Ingram is I comp him with Mike Tyson, because he always just tries to knock you out, and with how his play style is that something that might be maybe, for lack of a better term, frowned upon as far as how you guys like to grade your offensive linemen because of the play style? Maybe his grades trend downward versus somebody else who doesn't have that same play style?
Yeah, same thing kind of applies there. Is whether it's the run or the pass game. It's if you really whiff, right? If you take the gamble and you really whiff, then you get downgraded heavier, right? And I think we have some people behind the scenes that look into some of these things as far as like offensive line stability, and we have some numbers behind the scenes about like just the percentages of the plays that are graded, say, positively or negatively, right? And that goes into it. The idea is that play to play, are you creating, let's say you have 65 plays in a game that you're in on, right? Out of all those snaps, how many more positives are you creating than negatives? Because there's offensive linemen that go through an entire game with hardly any of both, and they're kind of stable and they're low variance guys. Then there's guys like Ingram, where it can be he can make a great play one play and he can make an awful one the next, and it starts, and then we figure out how to balance it from there, right? Because I was a grader for 3 years, so on like a play-to-play basis, I know how that works. And you notice you do notice those guys who one way or the other are in on the action more, right? Where it's like, oh man, he really whiffed that one. And then the next play he gets a pancake. So there's high variance, just like there's high variance quarterbacks, right? We think about some of those gunslinging, Baker Mayfield's one of those gunslinging guys. There's definitely offensive linemen like that. So that can play a part in it when we're grading that, the individual plays. And then when it comes out at the end, it will kind of, there's sometimes it does need to be explained, because you have guys like Ingram who it's like, hey, listen, like he's either here or he's here. It's like one way or the other. So it always takes some level of tape watch to see what type of player you're dealing with. But that can definitely play a factor if he's swinging for the fences just like a quarterback would, and he misses, then it's going to be a problem.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And if you guys want access to some of this data, you're going to want to subscribe to PFF Plus, and we're very appreciative for Dalton joining us today. PFF has got you covered all season long with the best data tools and analysis in the game. Sign up for PFF Plus today to unlock all their famous player grades and premium stats. Push the playoffs in your fantasy league with in-season totals and award-winning rankings from fantasy expert Nathan Johnke, and stay connected to the next generation of talent with the best NFL draft coverage on the planet. No matter what you're looking for, PFF has what you need to make winning decisions all season long, and you can sign up for less than $10 a month. As we kind of move forward, Dalton, this defense with Brian Flores is, I call him a degenerate, because some of the things he does are just absolutely insane. Running a full cover zero, engage 8 style blitz to dropping into drop 8 Tampa 2 is significantly bonkers, and he's been doing that for a couple of years now. The interception Josh Metellus had on Jordan Love last year was from that exact look. He runs such a wide variety of stuff. When you kind of watch this defense, is there anything that you've ever seen, especially in your time of grading, that other than other stuff Brian Flores has done, that this resembles anything?
I think you know what it is. It's a style of coaching that we're seeing less and less now, right? Because defenses have been getting simpler over the years, and you're not seeing coaches get so exotic. There's still a couple of guys that'll do it right. I think about a Todd Bowles sometimes throws a lot of weird looks at you. I think you just used to get more defensive coordinators like this. I think about Bowles. I think about Dick LeBeau with the Steelers all those years. I think about Rex Ryan, who used to do a lot of weird stuff, whether it be he'd go zero blitz 1 week and then he would drop off, or when he had Darrelle Revis, he was coming up with all different things. I think there's just less coaches like Brian Flores now. And Flores, he's real old school, right? He came up under Belichick, and he's just – I think he must really enjoy week to week getting into all these different looks and getting the game plan, all this stuff, because I think it's a thing that's been taken out. Look, there are several teams in the league that I could tell you right now, it's Tecmo Bowl on defense. They run about anywhere from 4 to 6 plays for the entire game, and they just go, we want to do these 5 things the best in the NFL, and that's it. There is a tree of coaches like that. There's not as many coaches like Flores who go, I want to attack, I want to mess with quarterbacks. And I think the other thing, too, that Flores does a great job of, he finds the players that he wants who are versatile enough to do that. And he was lucky enough when he got to Minnesota to already have Harrison Smith, who, A, is the captain of the whole thing, and B, is as versatile as any player this generation has seen, right? But when I see them picking up guys like Ivan Pace Jr., right, who's a little weird because he's 5'10" and no one drafted him, but he's really good. Andrew Van Ginkel was one of my favorite offseason signings for any team, because I just, looking at that, I was like, oh, I get it. That's a Brian Flores thing, right? Like he's one of those guys that can move around. He could cover. He could go. He's got 2 pick sixes this year. He can do the sim pressure thing. He's a good pass rusher. Like, I think he's very good. And one thing he got, I think, from Bill Belichick is you want guys, even if you have guys that are only really good at one thing, you want those guys, because you can use that one thing. You can just let them do that one thing, even if it's for 20 snaps a game. I think it's why they wanted Dallas Turner so bad. He's such a good athlete, right? And he's a great pass rusher. We saw that at Bama, but people forget he dropped into coverage a decent amount at Alabama too. He had versatility to him. He's a great athlete. He ran a 4.4. So Brian Flores, on top of the system and all of that stuff, what always allows you to do what you want is to have the right players to do what you want, right? And that's just a group of players to me. And there's several examples where, some people would ask, they go, well, why would you get rid of a great pass rusher like Danielle Hunter to go get a guy like Van Ginkel? It's not that one is better or worse. It's just that they're different. And Hunter may not have fit Flores' defense. So he does a great job of mixing up schemes and then finding the right players that fit that. And again, defensive coordinators like that, they just love the game plan and mix it up every week instead of running the same things over and over.
Well, music to my ears, man. One of the things we've talked about a lot on this show is the fact that Hunter is a better player than Van Ginkel and Grenard, who honestly has been one of the better defensive linemen in the NFL this year. But they were way better fits for what Brian Flores wanted to do than Danielle Hunter, because Hunter is much more of a methodical style pass rusher. He does not have a quick get off, but once he gets into the rep, he's going to crush you. But getting into the rep, if you get in too slow with how Flores wants to play, that can mean the difference between you shutting out a guy or Justin Herbert dropping 400 on you. And we saw that a couple times last year. When it comes to some of these other free agent signings that you didn't mention, Grenard and then Blake Cashman, who has turned into one of the better linebackers in the NFL after dealing with injuries early on. But what have you seen from those guys that has really stood out to you? Because Grenard, going into week 6, was tied for second in the NFL in pressures with 29.
Yeah, look, Grenard's always been really good. And I think, like you mentioned, athletically, he's another guy. And he's younger than Danielle Hunter, too. But he's another guy who just fits that speedy kind of mold better. Now, he's not going to drop into coverage and do those sorts of things as much as Van Ginkel. But there's always been a need, I think, in Flores' defense to have one guy that's a little more of a classic pass rusher, right? That's going to be the guy who creates pressures in a traditional sense. And you mentioned, about Hunter's get off and things like that. Grenard's got a really good get off. And he was a really good player in Houston, too. I mean, I think Grenard, he's a little more classic. I think he brings a dimension in the run game as well that helps, right? He's got a solid run D grade too. He does need traditional pass rusher. I just think he wanted someone a little, like you mentioned, a little faster and a little bit younger than Danielle Hunter. And then Hunter went to a great situation in Houston where he can just be a classic, defensive end that we've seen for decades on end, right? One of those classic guys. So that's a good fit. And Cashman, I'll tell you what, that's just a guy who's really emerged. He's an athletic player. He was a late round pick of, I believe, the Jets actually. And he's just one of those guys, again, it's speed, right? It's just, they don't have to be, he doesn't necessarily like to use those big, old school 250, 260 pound linebackers, right? And I know they had guys like that in New England, like a Dante Hightower, and they made it work, but he's a guy who blitzed a lot, right? But where you have, say, an Ivan Pace, who's a really good blitzer, then you have Blake Cashman, who's a really good coverage guy, right? You're not going to blitz him, and you're not going to always ask him to do all of the things on early downs and run defense. You have other guys. So I think it's just a great job of using guys that maybe aren't superstars, but they're superstars at one or two things, right? And if Cashman's my coverage guy, if Van Ginkel's my tweener, if Pace is my blitzer, through the A gap and on early downs, he's messing around. Like, he just does such a good job. And Cashman's another good example of it, because in Houston, Cashman, that's a little more of a plain defense. He's just going to be asked to play linebacker in a traditional sense. Did a good job of it the first half of the year and then kind of slowed down, but Flores saw a role for him. And you have to love that he sees roles for these guys and he knows how to use them.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, Dalton, but Brian Flores, his daughter is friends with a former linebacker at the University of Minnesota, and he was an assistant under PJ Fleck. He found out about Cashman through him because obviously Cashman played at the U. Turned on his film back in November and's like, I want that guy, and that's how he came to be with the Minnesota Vikings, which I thought was cool. One thing that's interesting about this cornerback room, you mentioned Mekhi Blackman. They drafted Kyrie Jackson at 108, who unfortunately passed away in a tragic car accident in July. When the Vikings were building this cornerback room this offseason, they only made one really free agent addition. That was Shaq Griffin, who was honestly outperformed any of our expectations. He's been really solid throughout the course of the first 5 games. But this cornerback room, the way it was initially constructed, had me believing that maybe Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Brian Flores just don't value cornerbacks as highly as the rest of the National Football League, with the theory being, hey, if I have a handful of solid guys, and I related to the 2021 Bengals, nobody was great in that room, but nobody was this massive liability until that final drive when Eli Apple decided, be Eli Apple. When you look at this cornerback room and how these guys have constructed it, look, pre-injuries, because they had to stopgap with Fabian Moreau and Stephon Gilmore after that happened. Like, do you believe that they truly prioritize cornerback position, or they're going for more of a don't have a weak link approach?
I think this year was a don't have a weak link approach. I think you got to remember in the draft too, they were really looking at quarterbacks, right? And that's when that becomes a priority. And after last year, especially late last year, when they kind of started to fall apart a little bit on defense, they had a lot of needs, right? So they just decided, okay, let's figure out the front first and maybe the secondary later with late round picks. And again, Mekhi Blackman emerging last year as a really good player would have helped had he not got hurt in the preseason. But I think what you have, and one of kind of our theories over here, is your secondary. That's a great story you mentioned with the Bengals and Apple and all that too, because your secondary is as good as your weakest link, right? Because if you do have that one weak link over there, well, that's who they're going to throw at. Or if your weak link even is your linebackers, that's who they're going to throw at, or that one safety, or whatever they find, they're going to stick their thumb in it. So I think what you have, and and I'm seeing coverage grades that across the board are like solid. None of them are awful. So you have a bunch of guys who are playing reasonably well. And Flores, again, just does such a great job of mixing up coverages, right? When you talk about, sometimes it's man, like on Stephon Gilmore's game-winning pick against the Jets. Sometimes it's zone. He's run a lot more zone blitz this year. I think he feels like as long as everybody's doing their job back there to a reasonable level, they can mitigate that, right? They can mitigate it through play calling. They can mitigate it through blitzing. And then, obviously if those guys are playing good enough, cool. Look, it's not a requirement to have the best secondary in the league, right, to win a Super Bowl. And right now you look at it's greater than the sum of its parts, like you mentioned. If you don't have a weak link, because I look at the Vikings coverage grade right now. No huge names, no guys who are going to be first team All-Pro, nothing like that. But they're 9th in coverage grade as a team, And, as part of that, Van Ginkel getting a couple of pick sixes and making huge plays. Yeah, but you want to be stable, right? Just like we talked about before on the offensive line, being stable across the board. If your secondary is stable across the board, even if it doesn't have the big names or the Sauce Gardner or the best whoever in football, then you're still a good unit as long as you execute properly. And through 5 games, that's all they've done is execute properly in the front and the back, and everything's tied together with all the blitzing and everything he does and the coverages. And sometimes he'll drop 8, sometimes he'll go 0. I mean, he just does such a great job of helping his guys out and just getting them to execute.
One of the other things with this coverage unit is you have a guy like Byron Murphy Jr. who's getting, for lack of a better term, picked on. He's got he's one of the top 5 going into week 6, at least. He's one of the top 5 targeted corners in the league. Yeah, I think he was number 1, and then Gilmore was number 5. But when you look at some of like the overall stats, hey, they were 30th in pass yards allowed. Well, they're also like top 5 in EPA, success rate. And when you look at some of the individual performances when these guys are targeted, can you, I don't want to say, can you take it seriously that they're being like allowing this much production, but how much of that you have to take it with a grain of salt because the overall metrics on the back end are so good that, hey, maybe them Byron Murphy allowing like 11 out of 15 catches is really not as big of a deal as you might think.
Well, right. It's about a couple more things than that. Or how efficient is it, right? If he allows 11 out of 15 catches, well, is it did those 11 catches go for 200 yards, or did he make tackles and they went for 80 yards, right? And we gave up something reasonable. Okay, if we're giving up 7-8 yard catches, it's going to happen, right? You're not going to get a secondary and corners holding teams to 40 yards a week, right? So kind of taking, a big thing for me when I'm looking at coverage stuff, I'm looking at it right now. Like a Byron Murphy's given up 35 catches this year, 11.5 yards per catch. That's actually not terrible, right? And the big thing is not giving up explosives, right? And defensive coaches now, because you have so many offenses. First of all, the rules of the game have made it easier for offenses to succeed, right? But when you talk about the EPA per play being at the top level, when you talk about they're forcing turnovers, right? Getting 3 interceptions off an Aaron Rodgers or something like that, pick sixes and things like that. First of all, the turnovers turn the game around. Second, I really like to look at nowadays preventing explosives. And as a team, they do a good job with that. They don't give up a ton of home run balls, right? Okay, if you give up plays at the chains, fine. We'll have to live with that, and we'll keep fighting. Or if you hold them, they always talk about hold them to a field goal. That's kind of a win nowadays on defense. So, so they don't give up a ton of big plays. When you look at things like yards per reception, or we have yards per coverage snap behind the scenes, there's a part of it too. It's like the total pressures thing. How often are you screwing up? But also, how bad are you screwing up, right? Because look, if you give up an 8-yard catch for a first down, I'm not going to kill you. It is what it is. If you bust a coverage and give up a 65-yarder over your head, that's a lot bigger problem. So I think the Vikings just do a great job too of, not giving up home run balls, right? And if that's the goal because you don't have the lights out corners that maybe some other teams have, then so be it. I mean, it's working so far, and that's why then you turn around, maybe you give up a field goal, you turn around on offense, you go down and score like they've been doing. So that's sort of complementary football. It obviously helps your defense to not give up explosives, but it also sets a standard for your offensive. Like, okay, listen, we're going to go out there and we're going to give up 17 points today. If you can score more than that, we're good. And that's all. It's all about being, when you don't have the most talent in the league, you don't have the 85 Bears defense. So what are the winning goals, right? And that's what that's what the Vikings do every week, is they just find those winning goals, even if they don't pitch, say, a shutout, right? But right now they're giving up 15 points a game is spectacular. I mean, there's no complaint. There's no complaining about that to me. So if they continue to just not give up explosives, they'll be just fine.
We did get a super chat from Aerocane777 that kind of talks about some of this, because we were talking about the context of some of the yardage allowed. And he asked, how much does PFF take into account teams having to play from behind and throw more against the Vikings? And I think one of the things he's kind of referring to is garbage time, where the Vikings honestly beat the living hell out of the Texans. They really beat the hell out of the 49ers and the Packers, even though the scoreboard doesn't reference it nearly as much as the Texans game. But how much, when you're looking at some of those things, how much does win probability play into some of the grading principles that you guys use?
I think what it is more so for us, because we do grade every play. We do grade every play the same, just about, unless it's like maybe the last minute of the game where it's really like shot. But I think it's more then about looking at things like rate stats instead of just, okay, say Byron Murphy with the total of 35 catches, right? Where yards per reception matters, right? Or even say a completion percentage for a corner. We have that for every coverage player too. How many of those are you allowing, right? There's more of the rate stats that go into it, because high volume can be a thing, right? Again, if you give up 300 yards on 20 attempts, not great. If you give up 300 yards on 60 attempts, a lot of this, surface level people, oh, that guy threw for 300 yards. But if he did it on 60 attempts, the defense is actually winning there. That's not efficient, right? 5 yards a pass is not efficient, right? So it's a matter of looking at efficiency and a lot of the rate stats. And yeah, you got to do some digging sometimes on it and like understanding that, okay, even for an individual player, if Byron Murphy one day gave up 7 catches for 30 yards, I'm going to go, wow, he had a really good day. Actually, he's making tackles, even if he didn't have an interception. I go, okay, you got targeted at least 7 times or at least 7 catches and only gave up 30 yards. That's actually really good. Whereas if he gave up 7 catches for $150, okay, then I have a problem, right? So it is the context as far as more than just, okay, the total number of yards, right? Or the total number of receptions. There's an efficiency level to it, because, I think anybody would sit there and go, look, if an opposing offense is in garbage time and they're just racking up 60 passing attempts, the numbers are going to look different. You have to look at them a little bit different, and then just go. And the grading is what it is, and we try to put as much of the context into the grading as we can, knowing that, like, okay, sometimes things get a little tilted and you have to parse through and really find it. That's why even in that Packer game, when I went on our NFL review show, and I was like, look, for 2.5 quarters, they were spectacular. That's not a question. Did it balance out a little bit because Jordan Love tried to make the comeback? Yeah, but understand what we're looking at here and how early this game was over.
Yeah, absolutely. And this defense is going to be so much fun to watch for a lot of the reasons that you just mentioned. Before we go, I did want to ask you, and I mentioned this pre-show, you did have the Vikings at 4-13 this year, and don't necessarily blame you. I had them with 7 or 8 wins. Well, we were kind of on the same thought process, but the Vikings already have 5 wins, and I want to ask you, because one of the things we like to do is, kind of learn about evolving process, and how have you evolved your thought process on the Minnesota Vikings over the course of the first 5 games, and where do you see them now going forward throughout the rest of the season?
I mean, first, as far as right now, you have to look at them as a playoff contender, right? They're 5-0, and I know they're probably in the best division in football right now, but they're the ones leading it, and these divisional games in the NFC North are going to be a lot of fun. But no, for me, I think I weighted it too heavily towards the quarterback, right? And looking A, at the schedule, and B, what is a tough division. It's incredibly tough division. Looking at the schedule within their division, kind of assuming that they were at such a disadvantage, especially at quarterback and on defense. I did not expect their defense to be playing this well, even though I liked some of the pieces they picked up. I thought it was going to take another year for their defense to get like this, especially with the Blackman injury. I was really concerned about that. Their secondary, I guess Harrison Smith's just never going to age. Also, he's just gonna play. He's gonna pull a Tom Brady and play like this forever. But no, I definitely underestimated the impact. How much impact some of those newer pieces could have on defense. And then I'll be honest with you, I doubted Sam Darnold. I did. And I think I doubted how much that environment could do for Sam Darnold and how much Kevin O'Connell could do for Sam Darnold. I kind of, because we hadn't seen this level of play from him before, I guess I kind of made the assumption of like, well, in all likelihood, it'll be same old Sam, right? We're used to seeing him with the Jets and the Panthers and things like that, and it wasn't great. But he's protected the football. He's played great in the play calls that have been given to him. Obviously, he's more decisive than he used to be. And honestly, I kind of forget sometimes he's still a young guy. When he got drafted, he was the youngest starting quarterback in the NFL, and now he's still only, what is he, 27 now, is he?
He turned 27 in June, so he's a fresh 27.
I mean, he's still incredibly young when it comes to, it's not like a running back being 27, right? As a quarterback, he's still got 10 years left in him, right? So I think it was just, for me, that was the two big things, is underestimating Darnold. Absolutely. That's without question. And then I think I was very worried about their secondary after Mekhi Blackman got hurt. And Brian Flores, honestly, the one thing I like with him too, even with not the best secondary, but he's making it work, is the play calling even for him is a little bit different than last year. Last year, it was like we're either sending everybody or we're dropping everybody. Now you're seeing a lot of different looks where it's like we could go 5-man rush, we could go zone blitz, we could simulate pressure. There's so many different things that he's put in now in year 2 of doing this that it's really added value. You mentioned it. As long as you don't have any weak links and you execute, this is what they can look like. So I definitely underestimated Darnold and the secondary.
Hey, you weren't the only one, man. We definitely underestimated them to a point too. And I want to bring in producer Dave before we wrap up. Dave, do you have any questions here for Dalton before we get out of here this afternoon?
I have one. You've mentioned Harrison Smith twice, and your eyes light up. You obviously have great respect for the man. Do you think, especially with how Hall of Fame is being selected, do you think he makes the Hall of Fame? Do you think there's a more move to get PFF grades to get somebody in rather than just Pro Bowls and All Pros and the, requirement of having Super Bowls under your name?
Look, I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where people revere us like that, right? But I love the idea for us that we put the context into it, right? The other one I've been chirping about lately is Levante David, right? Even though I think he's only made like a couple of Pro Bowls, but you go, this guy's such a good football player. He was just stuck on all those bad Tampa Bay teams for a while, right? And didn't get the recognition till later. No, I personally, I do think Harrison Smith, I would put him in the Hall of Fame. I mean, I'm looking at it now. 8 different seasons where he's played at least 1,000 snaps. So effective. I mean, he's going to be 36 years old soon, and he's still one of the best safeties in the league, one of the most versatile safeties in the league. That's a guy, that I would consider him a Hall of Famer. He's one of the best safeties of this generation, and to still be doing it in his 13th season is just incredible. And I just think for individual players, we can't always do the thing where, oh, well, he didn't win a Super Bowl. Well, how is it? Is it Harrison Smith's fault that he never won a Super Bowl? He's one of 22 guys on the field, and generally safeties aren't going to carry you to a Super Bowl. It's not how it works, right? So such a great player, and I think for defensive players especially, it's a lot harder because people get caught up in their traditional stats, and now he's got plenty of them, so he shouldn't have an issue there. But I think when you talk about like certain players who are just so great at what they do, and maybe you just have to find a little more context to it, right? A Harrison Smith, or even a guy like, I was glad that somebody like Patrick Willis is getting in, even though he had such a short career, because he was so great. I mean, there was like no question. There was a 7-year stretch where Patrick Willis was the best linebacker in football. I don't know if they'll ever start using our stuff like that, but I think it helps it just helps build the context of, say, like how great this guy is, or even Aaron Donald, who just retired, how we're like, hey, this might actually be the greatest defensive tackle like ever, not just of this generation. Like, it just builds that context more and more. But Smith, to me, yeah, absolutely. I would put him in for as great as he's been for this long of a time. It's still great at 35, 36 years old. Absolutely. Put him in there.
Cool. Hey, we wish to thank you for coming on today and talking Minnesota Vikings.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate you guys having me on for sure. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, glad to have you. Where can the people find you? What do you guys have cooking up over at PFF?
We've got the written content, as always. You mentioned PFF Plus subscription too at PFF.com. Me and a lot of our other great analysts that we have writing content there. I'm on the NFL grade release / review show with Trevor Sikkema on Mondays at 1 Eastern, 12 Central. And I'm also co-host of the PFF College Football Show. Sunday mornings and Tuesday nights, we review and preview all the biggest college football games, if that's your guys' thing up there, too, and break it all down. Me and my buddy Max Chadwick, we break down all of that, all the biggest games of the week.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us, Dalton. Everybody, make sure you tune in tonight. Scolders and Spice with Sal, 8:30 p.m. Central Time, live. We'll be back tomorrow night, 6:05 p.m. Central Time, live every Wednesday. I'm Tyler. He's Dalton. He's Dave. SKOL Vikings, everybody.
Like, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notifications. It helps us grow this community that we all love, our Minnesota Vikings. And on behalf of Tyler Forness and myself, Dave Stefano, thank you so dearly for watching The Real Forno Show. SKOL, everyone.